Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 6. Once his grandfather dismissed him, Hannibal decided to ride down to Mr. Stamets' office in Hartford Town, just to set eyes on the bustling village again. The road between the estate and the town was properly paved now as well, a simple pattern of plain cobblestone that followed the worn, old dirt lane. He wondered at how industrious they'd become to put such a thing in, and thought them all very clever for it, making it far easier for them to move from the village proper to the various places on the estate that employed them, and on to the greater roads to the capital. Mr. Stamets' office was above the bakery, the little sign proclaiming that he was in. Hannibal dismounted and idly fastened his bad-temper mount to a free ring on the plaster-coated wall, his amber eyes flitting around to take in the changes he'd noted. There were new shops, new faces, of course. In fact, the town had grown substantially in his absence. Hannibal meandered down the main street, noticing that even the side streets were paved, albeit with less fanciful designs. Everything had a fresh air about it, scrubbed clean and newly whitewashed, enough so that he wondered if his grandfather had ordered Hartford Town made ready for his visit. He considered this as he roamed about, nodding here and there to others on the walkways. Very few recognized him. Only those old enough to remember him from his misspent youth, one of whom owned the bakery he ended up back in front of after his unplanned walk about town. Mr. Woodward was still holding his place at the counter, spectacles dusted with specks of flour and his graying hair wisping every direction. He caught sight of Hannibal coming in through the door and grinned, calling, "As I live and breathe, if it isn't Hannibal Lecter, Lord Clarges himself. Come here, my boy, come." Hannibal gladly greeted him, not minding the familiarity of the hug he was drawn into. "You were no taller than my chin last I saw you. Where you been, boy?" Mr. Woodward asked, and immediately called, "Katie, bring tea and a few tarts to the front." I shouldn't stay. I'm on an errand for grandfather and got distracted. I wanted to see how much the village had changed." "Greatly, Lord Clarges, greatly indeed. Come, here's tea. Have a seat, chat a moment," he was told, and had no polite way to refuse. He was guided to a small table near the window and bundled into a seat, while Mr. Woodward's daughter brought out the requested refreshments. The tea was hot and strong, and suited him very nicely. He nibbled the tart politely, despite having been stuffed back at the house fit to burst. "Ah, you must be very surprised by all the changes, Lord Clarges. Have you met with Mr. Graham?" Hannibal stiffened and managed to say with admirable neutrality, "I've not had the occasion to deal much with him." "Ah, well, you are but newly home, yes," Mr. Woodward said, sipping his own tea and smacking his lips. "I'm used to seeing him of a morning. He likes to ride over and watch the town wake up." Hannibal frowned, settling his cup in its saucer as gently as he could. I had not realized he was so familiar with Hartford Town. "He's been here a solid 6 years now. Of course, you've been trying to arrange to come home. My compliments to the Duke on his choice, Lord Clarges. He's a well-spoken, bright little fellow, to be sure. He spent near an hour on in the fields when he first arrived here, watching the threshing machine at work, asking all sorts of questions. I sent him to the foreman for his answers." He uttered a good-natured, pleased chuckle, as if it had been a moment of true fondness. Hannibal just frowned, subsiding in his chair and thoughtfully finishing his tea. "I imagine he spends quite a lot of time amusing himself in town," he finally ventured. He pictured Will's slender body in his dark, solemn clothing, and the embarrassing scarcity of his wardrobe, and inwardly cursed, knowing he had been no spendthrift in the case of clothing, at least. "Oh, he comes down now and then to purchase for the house, my lord, for cook's sake or at Mr. Hawke's request," Woodward amiably said, pushing another tart towards him that Hannibal found quite menacing to his unsettled stomach. "But he does spend quite a bit of time attending to the estate with Lord du Maurier since Mr. Verger's gone." Hannibal's frown deepened at the thought of his younger cousin showing off his spouse, however unwanted he was. Anthony had married Will by proxy and had always been partial to him in letters. Hannibal's suspicious nature seized on the niggling idea that perhaps the reason was that Anthony himself had designs on Will. It would be a sure way to best his elder cousin, stealing his spouse from under him. Anthony was an alpha, after all, and if he was seduced by Will into bonding, why then nothing could be done about it. He knew without a doubt that the reason Anthony had never married was in case the Duke decided to annul Will's marriage to Hannibal and hand it all over to his cousin in one fell swoop. It annoyed him to think of Will seducing Anthony and making a fool of him, but it would solve one of his problems. At least if Will wound up in Anthony's bed, he'd be out of Hannibal's hair and someone else's problem, and there was nothing his grandfather could say about it. He would no doubt vilify Anthony for his conduct, and no longer consider him for the line of succession, leaving Hannibal quite secure. "Yes, clever little fellow indeed," Mr. Woodward said, beaming. "I wish there were 3 more just like him." "Well, much to my misfortune," Hannibal intoned, standing to take his leave, "there is only the one, and he is my problem to deal with. Good day, Mr. Woodward." It was only once he'd scaled the stairs to Mr. Stamets' office that his brain brought up the other statement, that of Verger, the estate manager being gone. Frowning, Hannibal pounded on the door and let himself in without a greeting, finding Mr. Stamets quite alarmed and pale behind his desk. "Ah, Lord Clarges, His nervous eyes shifted, his pale hands groped over his desk in search of salvation, a pitiable display of ineptitude. "Pray do not fall into a faint, or I will be forced to find myself truly contemptuous of you," Hannibal warned, tossing down the envelope that held his grandfather's addendum. He ungenerously noted that Mr. Stamets had attempted to grow a mustache in the past 6 years, and that it had the sad look of an overused shaving brush clinging to his face. "Grandfather wants these sent to the capital immediately. Changes to the ownership of Hertford House." Mr. Stamets' hands trembled as he picked it up, hesitantly offering. "There is no seal. It's an addendum only," Hannibal reiterated, moving to the window to look down at the street below. "His lawyers in the capital will find it all quite tidy, I'm sure." "Yes, Lord Clarges," Mr. Stamets said, rallying. "I will send someone tonight to deliver it in the morning. Does his Grace wish a copy for his records?" Hannibal waved that away, saying, "Whatever you usually do in cases like this, Mr. Stamets, shall suffice well enough." He heard papers being shuffled and studied, movement behind him as the addendum was prepared. Abruptly unable to control his curiosity any longer, he asked, "What has happened to Mr. Verger?" Mr. Stamets uttered a soft "eep" of surprise behind him, and Hannibal very studiously did not turn around to glare at him, as that would in no way help his current line of inquiry. Instead, he patiently waited until the beta man said, "It was discovered that he was fleecing the estate, Lord Clarges, of quite a large sum every year. Nearly the whole of Hertford House's profits, I believe, meagre though they were." Hannibal did turn then, scowling slightly, and asked, "How was the theft discovered?" Mr. Stamets paled, if that was even possible for a man of his anemic complexion, and softly offered, "Mr. Graham checked his books and reported it to the Duke immediately." Hannibal's brow drew down in a grim glare. Am I to assume that the Earl of Reddig somehow found himself poking into the business of my estate manager, Mr. Stamets? Or are you trying to tell me an Omega was able to identify a mathematical error? Because they are equally unbelievable to me, sir. Mr. Graham, as in your spouse, milord, Mr. Stamets corrected, too nervous to be lying. It must have been a very obvious ploy indeed for him to find it, Hannibal mused, wondering why in the 7 hells Will was bothering the estate manager anyway. "Actually, milord, was very well hidden," Mr. Stamets said, seeming much more relieved on the count that Hannibal would not strangle him out of turn for mentioning his unwanted spouse. "The Duke's accounts were quite dismayed when Mr. Graham brought them to confirm. Mr. Verger is now in jail serving a sentence for fraud and theft." "And who, pray tell, was hired in his stead?" No one, my lord," Mr. Stamets answered, petting his heavy mustache, which made him look like a woeful walrus with a nervous condition. Hannibal heaved a sigh, adding that to his mental list of things to tend to while he was home. An estate the size of Hertford House required constant attention, hence the estate manager. With no one to tend the books all this time, things were surely falling to rack and ruin, just as he had feared, as Anthony was hardly a stand-in. He could not fathom why his grandfather had not contacted him earlier with such things in a deplorable state. "Is there anything else of crippling importance I should know before one of the townsfolk sees fit to tell me, Hannibal asked, arching one brow in a haughty, scathing look. "No, Lord Clarges," Mr. Stamets said, swinging back towards faint again. "Very well," Hannibal sighed, annoyed with him, but feeling like a bully thanks to the man's insufferable pandering to the Lecter family. "Good day, Mr. Stamets." "Good day, Lord Clarges." It sounded every bit as relieved as Mr. Stamets had attempted to prevent it from sounding. Out of sorts and brimming with tea and pastries, Hannibal retired his horse and took the road back to Hertford House at an easy trot, squinting against the sun as it angled across the sky toward the horizon. He slowed the horse to a walk when he reached the shade of old trees that sheltered the greatest extent of the road, allowing the breeze to cool his irritation. It immediately flamed again as he arrived at the house and saw Will and another figure approaching from the other side of the estate, leading their horses and talking with their heads pressed together, thick as thieves. Hannibal drew the horse to a stop and dismounted, leading it towards his troublesome spouse and what turned out to be his bounder of a cousin, Anthony. Neither one of them had shoes on, and their pants legs were rolled up to their knees, jackets loosened. Hannibal could see their boots slung from the empty saddles, tied by their neckerchiefs along with all manner of mystifying gear. "Is this how you've spent your time in my absence?" he asked, startling both of them. Will looked up at him, and the mischievous smile on his full lips vanished at once, replaced with wary tightness that irked Hannibal to see. Anthony just looked guilty, as well he should. "Will has been working non-stop the past couple of weeks," Anthony said, rising to his defense as stupid alphas were so often wont to do for their Omegan counterparts. "I decided to break him out and take him fishing." "Fishing," Hannibal echoed, as if he'd never heard of such a thing before. He spied the picnic basket and pointedly asked, "And lazing about eating as well?" "Lord Clarges," Will said, careful to keep his voice calm and even despite the sudden spike in his awareness. He fretfully lifted one hand to his open shirt collar, regretting the loss of neckerchief that usually helped to shroud his scent. "I am sure you have more pressing business to tend to than questioning either one of us." Hannibal's eyes narrowed at that, noticing how Will touched his bare throat with slender fingers, brushing the pulse that ticked visibly beneath his white skin. He could scent him now, at last, just faintly, sweet, hot, and edible, even more compelling than the baker's delightful confections. It prickled at Hannibal's nerves, and he resented it, which only made him more inclined to view his spouse with greater affront. "I can only imagine the gossip about you when the servants see you in such a state," Hannibal said, his gaze dropping to Will's bare, muddy feet. He suddenly noticed the fish dangling from a cord in Will's hand, the same hand he was leading his mount with. It was quite a large fish. Hannibal wondered how he held it so easily, weak as Omegas tended to be. "The servants are used to my oddities, and are very forgiving, considering I am possessed of only half a mind," Will said, rapidly growing angry with the sudden critical interest Hannibal was taking in him after 6 years of relative freedom. "Hannibal," Anthony said, attempting to ease the sudden tension that sprang between them. "It was just a little fun." "I suppose that's all it ever is," Hannibal said, dragging Anthony into his judgmental gaze. "Hannibal," Will said, drawing heavily on his patience, reminding himself that he was calm, even-tempered, difficult to agitate. "Running about barefoot like some sort of hoyden," Hannibal continued, ignoring him in favor of berating his cousin. "Hannibal," Will said again, blowing out a breath of frustration when he continued to be ignored like a brainless child. "Now, see here. As an alpha, Anthony, you should at least have tried to correct him," Hannibal said, heedless of the dangerous spark in Will's eyes. "Hannibal, I am standing right here. They are malleable creatures, cousin, easily swayed to unbecoming behaviors." He was quite suddenly and shockingly smacked in the face with the cold, slippery side of Will's catch, hard enough that he stumbled sideways, unprepared for the force of it. Aghast, he stared in open-mouthed shock at Will, whose cheeks were blooming with pink fury, looking very much like a Valkyrie on the wing. "How is that for unbecoming behavior?" Utterly at a loss for how a diffident, silly Omega could manage to channel such shocking temper, Hannibal just mutely stared after him as Will turned on his heel and marched towards the house without a backwards glance, the unfortunate trout swinging like a pendulum from his tight little fist. Anthony recovered faster than Hannibal and darted after Will with both horses, his throaty laughter enough to finally snap him out of it. Unwilling to chase after them for the sake of his pride, Hannibal contented himself with saying, "Utterly unstable, ridiculous things, Omegas," which in no way dismissed the fact that Will had, against all of Hannibal's expectations, and directly contrary to the truths as he saw them, coshed him with a fish almost as big as he was. It was massively unsettling. His smarting cheeks smelling unpleasantly of trout, Hannibal tipped his chin up, stiffened his back, and hastily handed his horse off to a stable boy so that he could go to his suite and have another wash. It took Will a very long time to calm down, and he blamed that on Hannibal too. He knew well enough how his gift worked by now, and resented that his bond to Hannibal meant he reflected his unwanted husband so quickly and with such effect. He had just been so angry. "I've worked too hard to be spoken to in such a way," he said, feeling his temper rise again, so rare in him until he was well and thoroughly put out. Jimmy nodded vigorously, straightening Will's cuff to fasten it at his slender wrist. "Malleable and easily swayed to unbecoming behaviors," he said. Will quoted, fire rising in his eyes. "I can't remember when I've been so offended." "Lord Clarges is a man who values his opinion rather higher than most," Jimmy said, the most unfavorable comment he'd offered so far. Will's eyes glazed slightly with the memory, and suddenly said, "I slapped him in the face with the fish, Jimmy." "I'm sorry, Mr. Graham, you did what?" Jimmy asked with delicacy, looking up with the hint of smile playing around his full mouth. "I slapped him in the face with the fish," Will whispered, a burble of laughter escaping him. He clamped both hands over his mouth before he could dissolve into giggles, tears of mirth escaping him when Jimmy sucked his lips in and bit down to keep from unseemly laughter. There was no stopping it then. Their mutual amusement, Jimmy cackled like a laying hen with delight, eyes wide, and Will stifled his own horrified laughter with his pillow. I don't know what came over me," he finally gasped, now shocked at his own behavior without Hannibal's expectations to skew him. "He just ignored me like I wasn't even there, and I was so angry." "If anyone needs to let out a little anger, Mr. Graham," Jimmy managed, hitching his laughter, "it's you." "Oh, besides, it's not as if you hurt him. It was a trout, for God's sake, not a hammer." "I have no idea how I'll get through dinner," Will admitted, standing when Jimmy gestured so that he could be helped into his dinner jacket, both of them still fighting amusement. "I just keep seeing that look on his face. I think his horse could have spoken to him in French, and he'd be less surprised." "Well, he is rather unusual in his assumptions about Omegas. A sexist of such caliber that other sexists cringe in embarrassment," Jimmy said, buttoning him swiftly into his jacket and taking up his neckerchief to spritz it with the scent killer. It was just an added precaution, as all of Will's freshly washed clothing was soaked in the stuff before being left to dry, as per his request. "Especially considering he's only ever known one." "One?" Will echoed, tipping his chin up for Jimmy to layer and knot the cloth for him. "Jimmy, you must tell me now that you've mentioned it." "I shouldn't have said anything," Jimmy said, concentrating on his task. "The Duke has forbidden us to speak of her, and there's nothing worth mentioning anyway." "Except that she ruined Hannibal on Omegas?" "Well, that, if the rumors are true," Jimmy conceded, fussing with Will's coat and cuffs. He finished and put both palms on Will's shoulders, warmly squeezing him and telling him with earnest concern, "Don't think about it, okay? Won't do you any good, and certainly won't endear you to Lord Clarges." "Worse than coshing him with a trout?" Will meekly asked, feeling the dangerous return of laughter threatening to steal his calm. "Worse than coshing him with a whole river of trout." "Come on, it's time," Jimmy said, patting him again before heading for the door. "Lovely night you're in for, Mr. Graham. You, Lord Clarges, and Lord du Maurier. Lucky for you, I think the Duke is feeling well enough to command the table tonight." Will exhaled softly in relief and took himself down to the formal dining room, pausing on the stairs when Anthony called down to him from the landing. "United front," he said when he caught up to Will, dressed in one of the few sets of formal wear the staff kept secreted away for him in one of the guest rooms. "Partners in crime and all." Will smiled at that, walking in stride with him down to the dining room. His humor evaporated abruptly at the sight of Hannibal already seated, his fine mouth pursed with irritation and murderous thoughts lighting his amber eyes. "Where's grandfather?" Anthony asked, deflecting the tension with his question and using it to give Will time to take his seat without being set upon. "He's declined to join us," Hannibal said, gesturing for the footman to begin serving. He noticed that Will's formal dinnerware was just as bleak and plain as his daywear, and felt a twinge of annoyance, feeling as if the world must think him a jealous miser for keeping his spouse in such dour, plain clothing. "I'm glad to see that you remembered to dress for dinner, Will, though wearing shoes must no doubt pain you significantly." "And I am glad you remembered to wash beforehand," Will said, his voice mild and calm as Hannibal's, exercising what he considered exemplary self-control to keep from laughing at the memory of Hannibal's surprised expression. "Trout is such a pungent fish." Hannibal's lips twitched in a quickly repressed smile, and he cleared his throat, regaining his former frown when he sternly reminded himself that Omegas were far too ignorant to express humor on purpose. "I had not expected you to show your face here, Anthony," he said, shifting his attention to his cousin, who looked quite amused and relaxed when he had no right to be. "Oh, well, I'm here rather a lot recently," Anthony said, volunteering the information with a grin as he took up his silverware. "Will tends to pine." Hannibal's noble nose wrinkled. He didn't justify that with a response, except to warn, "Don't be crude." The appetizer was ladled neatly into waiting bowls, hot and fragrant. "Eel soup?" Hannibal inquired, tasting a spoonful, and finding it delicious, as all of Cook's recipes were. "It's Anthony's favorite," Will said, taking a tentative taste of his own. "I had Mrs. Pims alter the menu." "What on earth for?" Hannibal asked, annoyed for no reason he could fathom, except that Will had gone out of his way for his cousin, and he did not like that in the least. "Because it was no trouble, and I had already planned a soup starter," Will said, giving him a quizzical look. "You set the menu? But Cook always sets her own menu." "Not for some 6 years now, Lord Clarges," Will said, a hint of a smile playing around his red lips. Hannibal found himself staring. It was unconscionable, he knew, that someone should have such a mouth and smile with it in such a way. There must be laws to protect gentlemen from such smiles, surely. He was visibly startled from staring when Will added, "I have taken up duties of the absent Duchess for your grandfather's sake." "That isn't all he's taken up," Anthony cut in, putting away the soup with ungodly haste. "Other than coshing perfectly innocent gentlemen in the face with trout?" Hannibal asked, noting the way Will ducked his head, which was certainly more akin to amusement than shame. "I cannot imagine." "He runs the estate, Hannibal," Anthony said, practically crowing about it. "I beg your pardon. I'm afraid I didn't hear you correctly. Omegas can hardly choose their own clothing without an Alpha's approval. How on earth could Will manage to run an estate?" "You're absolutely right, Lord Clarges," Will said, overriding Anthony's indignant response. He took a delicate taste of his soup, his spoon sliding between his plump lips with smooth ease. Hannibal found it shockingly obscene, and fought not to tell him so as Will removed his spoon from his mouth with equally unsettling grace. He wet his lower lip with the tip of his pink tongue, and added, "I imagine the entire place has fallen to ruin." "I can only think so, considering there has been no estate manager," Hannibal said, glaring at the spoon in Will's hand, idly thinking that perhaps he should have the silver changed. It was simply defective tableware to blame. "The house is practically falling down around us," Will said, glancing down at his spoon where Hannibal's glare was directed. He tucked it into his soup against all good manners, mystified when his husband's amber eyes tracked the movement. "Isn't it just?" Hannibal responded, lifting his gaze to find Will's blue eyes on him, sparkling with amusement, and he cleared his throat again, annoyed because surely Will was not intentionally baiting him? "Why, I cannot imagine we are even able to dine in here, shoddy as things have become," Will said, wondering how far Hannibal would allow him to go before he realized what he was agreeing with. About that far, apparently. He glared at Will and gruffly said, "You are perverse. Then we have something in common after all," Will meekly told him, and took a sip of his wine to hide his smile. Anthony looked from Will to Hannibal, his blue eyes flickering back and forth. Whatever he thought of the situation, he wisely kept to himself and finished his soup. Their places were cleared away and replaced with the meat course, accompanied by a slew of very lovely vegetable dishes. It was a lavish enough dinner for just family, though Hannibal irritably thought it should be more grand in honor of his homecoming. I can hardly contain my curiosity about what main course an Omega would choose when left to its own devices, Hannibal said, turning his ire on Will himself when the pornographic spoon was removed as a target. Will lowered his head again. Hannibal had the feeling once more that he was only just barely containing the urge to laugh. He raised his head, his lovely face set to studious serenity as the lid was lifted from the platter. Hannibal stared at the contents in consternation, as Will mildly told him, "Trout, my lord." Hannibal looked from the platter to Will's tranquil, suspiciously blank face, and ruefully admitted that his spouse was a rather unusual example of Omega nature, especially the way his blue eyes twinkled with amusement that chased away his usual sadness. It was incredibly upsetting, to say the least. "Is this the same fish you slapped Hannibal with?" Anthony asked, all innocence. Will's voice was even and prim, betraying nothing more than polite calm when he said, "Yes." Anthony laughed, waiting for the pieces to be served before saying, I never dreamed to see you so taken aback, Hannibal." "I believe anyone would be taken aback," Will said before Hannibal could retort, taking his silverware into dainty white hands, "were they slapped with a fish. I'll thank you not to make excuses for my state of being when you are the one responsible for it," Hannibal said, deciding to eat the creature that had so offended him, as eating Will was certainly not an option. At least, not in such a literal way as this. "I do apologize for defending you, Lord Clarges," Will said, amused by Hannibal's beleaguered expression as much as by the presence of the fish. "I will not, however, apologize for my behavior. You were being provoking. You behaved like a savage," Hannibal pointed out and glared at Anthony to still his snickering. "You refused to listen to me," Will softly countered. "So you settled on a violent assault with a trout? You had agitated me. I will show considerably more caution in the future, lest I be caught with something more dangerous than a fish." "Then I believe I have made my point." "Your preference for settling things with violence is not a point," Hannibal said, and to Anthony, "You will control yourself, sir, or remove yourself upstairs." "I can hardly do either," Anthony said, helpless with laughter, looking from one to the other. "I would never forgive myself for missing this." "Have a care, Anthony, lest you agitate Will," Hannibal warned, gesturing around the dining room with his fork. "There are any number of items at hand for you to be brained with." "I believe this conversation has run its course," Will cut in, gesturing for more wine. "Everyone, let's please enjoy dinner, dangerous as it may be." Hannibal began to argue, but abruptly cut off, unsettled by how much Will's sparkling blue eyes could convey when his face was schooled to show so little. Had any other Omega even a pinch of Will's beauty, they would be deadly with it, he knew. He was very lucky that Will was not excessively smart, even if he was frighteningly pointed in his humor. Will glanced up and caught Hannibal's assessing glare, and cocked his head slightly. "Sickening," Hannibal had called him that day so long ago, and wondered if Hannibal was even now cataloguing his deficiencies, thanks to the reminder of the trout. In a low voice, so low he risked Hannibal not hearing him, he said, "Forgive me, Lord Clarges, if I have inadvertently ruined your appetite." Hannibal heard him, reluctantly realizing that Will's presence had indeed robbed him of his appetite, but not for reasons he was willing to admit. "Yes, well, I shall strive to enjoy it as I can despite it," Hannibal said, and found himself strangely disappointed to see the amusement in Will's eyes give way to cool reserve. The heavy courses were broken up by a refreshing citrus-shaved ice that Hannibal found quite to his liking. Luckily, nothing more dangerous than the trout made an appearance through their meal, which passed in idle chatter initiated and sustained by Anthony. Hannibal found himself quite annoyed by the easy familiarity between them, but could readily admit that if he had stayed these last 6 years, then he might have managed a similar rapport with Will. He was confoundingly unlike any other Omega that Hannibal had been exposed to, and certainly nothing even vaguely like his father's concubine. Hannibal had never in his life met an Omega who would dare to make him the butt of any joke or given him such mulish sharp looks as if he had somehow done something wrong. He wondered if he might not buy Will something sparkling and distracting. Surely then he would be amenable to Hannibal's advances? "What do you think, Hannibal?" Anthony asked, forcefully proving that he had not been paying any attention in the least to anything other than his spouse's tranquil face. Hannibal cleared his throat and said, I think that I have far too many issues with the estate that need addressing to pay much attention to such trifling things." Anthony seemed vaguely affronted by that, and Will's chin tipped up, cheeks pinkening with sudden color that was quite becoming on him. "Hannibal," Anthony said, but Will lifted his hand to hush him. "No, Anthony, do not trouble Hannibal's mind with issues which are beyond him," Will said, his voice cold enough to keep the citrus ice frozen, and his words bringing a dark flush to Hannibal's cheeks. Before he could scold him for being so pert, Will airily overrode him with, "Lord Clarges, you went to the village today. Can I assume you settled your business then with the Duke?" Hannibal frowned softly, thinking of the agreement they'd struck, what he'd decided to do to wrest control of Hertford House from Will's unknowing hands. "Yes," he said, seeing the almost imperceptible sag of relief fall over Will's slender, straight shoulders. "Then you will not remain over long," Will said, glad to be rid of him. Hannibal was a dangerous presence, however little Will allowed it to show. 6 years ago, Will had bonded to him instinctively during Hannibal's vicious tirade in a frightened attempt to submit to him, to somehow prevent his anger, to keep from being shattered from the inside out. He had been shattered, however, and quite thoroughly, but the bond had struck fast. All Will knew was that he was vulnerable to Hannibal in ways he was indifferent to other alphas he had the occasion to meet over the years. He was sensitive to his scent, drawn to look at him, attuned to his words and the sound of his voice in a way that made him impossible to ignore. In short, it was hell having Hannibal near him, reinforcing those ugly truths that Will had fought so hard to change for himself over the lonely, endless days and nights of the past 6 years. "I had not intended to stay any longer than necessary to settle our business," Hannibal said, watching Will's subtle responses, wondering why he inexplicably could not catch anything more than a faint trace of his scent again. Perversely, he added, "However, I have decided to remain for the foreseeable future." Will's face fell to stony, smooth stillness, his blue eyes half veiled by the thick fan of his lashes. "This is your home, no matter what your grandfather has put to his lawyers? I am sure you'll be comfortable here however long you decide to stay." "Excuse me, my lords, Mr. Hawks will serve brandy in the red drawing-room for you both." He got up with the same dignity and grace as a ruling monarch and left the dining-room, both alphas looking after him. "Well, that was badly done of you," Anthony said, drumming his fingers on the table before standing. "I cannot be held accountable for the fickle nature of an Omega, Anthony," Hannibal reminded him, rising and straightening his jacket fretfully. "I'm surprised he survived a dinner with 2 alphas without falling to tears or fainting dead away." Anthony snorted, dogging his steps as he headed for the drawing-room where a cheery fire was laid and 2 wing-back chairs were waiting. "Will? Faint?" Anthony scoffed, choosing a chair before Hannibal could and propping his feet up with a sigh. "You have no idea who you've married." "I have no idea who you have married," Hannibal said, taking the other chair with more grace and dignity than Anthony had mustered. "He's an Omega. That is all anyone ever needs to know of a person." "Good gods, man, your prejudice makes my teeth ache," Anthony said, shaking his head. "I remember her a little, you know. Your father's mistress. She was a terrible human being and a dangerous influence on your father, but she was just a human, Hannibal. We're all just humans. You judge every other person in your world by virtue of their character. Can you not extend the same courtesy to Will?" Hannibal frowned, taking the brandy offered by Mr. Hawks, who moved with the silent stealth of a cat despite his bulk. "You shouldn't have dismissed what he's done here, Hannibal," Anthony said, taking his own brandy and settling in. "It was incredibly rude of you to call it trifling. What, that he had the estate manager fired so that the place has run on its own steam for 6 years? Hannibal laughed, taking a sip. Frittered away grandfather's fortune to keep Hartford House afloat without proper skilled management? No. Updating the house, Anthony countered. Bringing in new businesses, adding tenants, converting the fallow fields to raise livestock. Hartford House is more than self-sufficient, cousin. Hartford House is productive thanks to his efforts. Hannibal pursed his mouth to hold in an automatic denial that an Omega couldn't possibly manage to do such. Instead, he said, I have seen no evidence of Will's hand in such things, and you are outwearing your welcome, Anthony. I will always have a place here while Will is in control of Hartford House, though I suppose now that might not be for much longer, Anthony said, and when Hannibal glared at him, he added, No, I haven't told Will. Grandfather asked me not to, though I cannot imagine why he has stooped to such deceit. Then you know of the changes he's made. Anthony nodded, unhappy. It's churlish and cruel, considering how much has been taken from Will already. But he is determined to have that child, and you are too stubborn to agree otherwise. Had he not promised me that Will would have a home here until his death, and made provisions for him in his will, then I would have warned your mate not to fall for it. Instead, I find myself complicit in my silence regarding your plots to oust him from his only home after everything he's done to make a life here. I'm more cad than you are. To being insufferable cads, then, Hannibal murmured, and Anthony toasted to that with a twisted, unhappy smile. Will had a terrible time getting to sleep, knowing that Hannibal would be sleeping in the room next to him. It worried him not so much because he feared Hannibal's intentions in regards to marital rights, but because he knew he couldn't trust himself. He had spent his entire life denying his Omega nature, and less than a full day in Hannibal's company had him doubting his own ability to control the thread of his instincts. He eventually fell into a restless slumber, his dreamscape transformed into an oceanside cliff, jutting up into the velvety night sky. He was perched there atop it, naked and trembling, and terrified because he could hear the rage in the waves crashing on the rocks below, hungry and demanding tribute. Do as he says. Whatever he wants of you, you give him. Do you understand me? Yes, father, Will said, hearing his voice from somewhere behind him. Hands shoved him forward, towards the black shadow of a man there at the summit. The roar of the furious ocean terrified him, but his father kept pushing him, telling him over and over to do whatever it took, to give whatever he needed to give, down to his blood and bones. Will took a step toward the cliff's edge, something deep inside of him telling him that it would be for the best, that the comfort he sought was there. It scared him almost to the point of freezing, and he wanted to turn back, but the more scared he got, the more steps he took until he was so near that form at the edge that he could smell the salty ocean. Hannibal was the person there before him, a murky, indistinct shape that wavered between shadow and starlit night. Come here, he said, and opened his arms in welcome. Frightened and desperate for comfort, seeking his alpha for protection from his father's shoving hands, Will flung himself forward, only for Hannibal to step aside. Will plunged from the cliff top towards the swelling, angry waves, the sound of Hannibal's amused laughter becoming the noise of his own gasping sobs as he spilled from his bed, trembling and terrified. Sweating and racked with shudders, Will pressed his hand to his galloping heart and buried his face against the side of his bed, willing reality to return. It was just a dream, he breathed, the words shortened and stuttering with the force of his panting. He wiped his tears on his sheet, swallowing back the sobs until he had them under control, grateful that his half-awake attack of nerves had gone unnoticed by anyone else. But the image of that cliff would not leave him. It stayed there in the back of his mind, threatening and dangerous, as his father's snarling voice, a stark reminder of what awaited him if he ever tried to pretend that his bond to Hannibal Lecter was anything other than an unwanted miscarriage of instincts, brought on in a stress-induced bid for escape.